Hey everyone, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. Um, the weather here in southeastern Pennsylvania has been getting chillier, particularly at night, although this today and tomorrow we're supposed to have quite a bit of a warm up, but next week, which is Thanksgiving week, it's going to get quite chilly, particularly at night, although even during the day, so I thought it would be a great time to discuss what you should cut back in the fall and what you should leave until the spring. And we've already started a little bit of our fall cleanup up, but there's still a lot of stuff standing. But now that it's going to get really, really cold, I feel like we're actually a little bit behind and we need to step up our fall cleanup. So come garden with me and let's discuss what to clean up in the fall and what not. So it's a bit of a debate about whether or not you should clean up all of your perennials in the fall or leave them to the spring. It really has more to do with what works for you, to be quite honest with you, than if there are just certain cutoffs, like these plants need to be cut back in the fall, or these plants need to be cut back in the spring. There are some plants that you should absolutely cut back in the fall, but again, it's really up to you, to be quite honest with you, and also depends on what climate you live in. I'm in 7A, which is southeastern Pennsylvania. Some winters can be brutal, some winters can be quite warm, but for me, what works best is cutting back most things in the fall. In our property, we're constantly creating new gardens, constantly transplanting, taking out old things, putting in new things, creating new beds. So in the spring, we don't have a lot of time to go around cutting back perennials that we left in the fall. So for us, time-wise, it just works to cut back those perennials in the fall so that we're not scrambling to get them done in the spring, which oftentimes means they've been kind of rotting all winter long, and in the spring they're just really messy. Now, that being said, there are some plants that you absolutely should cut back in the fall because it's just easier. Hostas, for example. Once the weather starts to be really, really cold for extended periods of time, the leaves of hostas just go mushy, and then it becomes really difficult to clean up. And when they kind of go mushy, they harbor slugs and snails. I guess it depends on where you live. If it's a problem for you, you definitely want to clean up that foliage so those pests are not overwintering in it and becoming a bigger problem for you in the spring. But for me, I just like a tidy garden. So getting rid of that hosta foliage is really just something that I like to do. So I have a list with me here, and we're going to go through different types of plants. Most popular plants is what I'm going to go through, like salvias, grasses, coneflowers, things that most people would have in their gardens, and then maybe follow up with some plants that maybe not a lot of people have in their gardens, but some people might. So they might benefit from some input on whether or not you should cut those plants back in the fall or wait till the spring. So we'll talk about them. I'll try to show you the plants that I have, and some of them I may have cut back. You can see how I cut them back, and if some of them need to get left with their basal foliage, I'll explain what that looks like. So here's an example of a hosta I did not cut back and a hosta I did cut back. So there's a few inches there that I left so that I can see where the plants are in the spring. Now I know where most of my plants are, so I don't have to leave that foliage, but it's not easy to get them to the ground, and that's not really a problem, leaving those stalks. This one has not been cut back, and it has not kind of gone mushy yet, but it's pretty close. So when your hostas start looking like this, it's time to cut them back. Here's a perfect example of what I mean by a hosta going mushy. So that foliage just all laid down on the ground and is a perfect hiding spot for insects and pests that are not beneficial in your garden. So that is definitely why you want to clean hostas up in the fall. Astilbe is another group of plants that you can either cut back or leave. It's really personal preference. The flower heads are dry and pretty. The leaves tend to go crispy and then drop off, but you're perfectly fine leaving the stalks of the dried flower heads for the season if you want. Again, for me, that'll just be something that's cut totally back so that I don't have to deal with it in the spring. Ladies mantle can be evergreen, so I leave it. I generally do a hard cut back of these in late summer because they start to look pretty raggedy. But the foliage can be evergreen. I'll leave that. If anything needs to be cleaned up in the spring, then that will get cleaned up in the spring. We only have about 5 or 6 of them here, so that's not a big chore. So one of the biggest groups of plants that I feel like most gardeners have in their gardens are coneflowers. Now this is what they look like when they're kind of dormant. They're kind of brown and crispy. A lot of people find that attractive, and you can definitely leave these through the winter. You may have some birds that will feed on the seed heads. Generally for us that happens in late August and September. I don't see a lot of birds feeding on my coneflowers throughout the winter, and because I do like a tidy garden and I don't want to wait until spring, usually we clean these up. Now I've left these because, as you can see, even with a few, I would say so far in the last 2 to 3 weeks, we have had several 20-degree nights, but we have still some coneflowers that have blooms and buds. So although we did cut some back in the front of our property because they had some diseases, these ones we've left standing, and until that pretty flower kind of is done for the season, I'll leave these standing. But generally we cut coneflowers back and we leave the basil foliage. Now basil foliage is what's still green in there, and I have a better example of some of them I cut back out front, and I can take you around and show you those. Here are some coneflowers that I just cut back over the weekend, and this is what I mean by leaving basil foliage. Any foliage that is still green and is not diseased, that is a big, that's pretty important. If the foliage is not diseased, then you can leave it, and it'll kind of protect the crown of the plant over winter. Now, as I said, if any of your foliage in any of your garden is diseased, you should cut that foliage back, get rid of it. I had some coneflowers in a different part of our property this year that developed a problem. I'm not sure if it was aster yellows or there's something that looks very similar to aster yellows. We dug those up and got rid of them. So if you discover problems late in the season and you're considering cutting back the foliage, if it's diseased, you should definitely get rid of it. Which brings me to bee balm. This is another plant that should get cut back in the fall. Unless you live in a climate where you don't get powdery mildew, you can leave it. But you can see that's powdery mildew. You do not want to leave the foliage of powdery mildewed plants around in the fall and just create a bigger problem for yourself in the spring. So for us, bee balm definitely gets cut back and the foliage gets put in the trash. We do not add this to any kind of compost we might be trying to make. Phlox is another plant that you should clean up in the fall. I've done a couple of hard cutbacks on my phlox this year because they were so covered in powdery mildew. Now, even though it's almost late November and they are blooming again, these will definitely get another hard cutback because they are, again, covered in powdery mildew. Now, even the disease-resistant types should still be cut back because if your garden tends to have maybe a lot of moisture over the winter, that powdery mildew can be harbored in the plant, so you don't want to leave that foliage to cause more problems for you in the spring. You can see here's a really bad example of a phlox with powdery mildew. Definitely want to get rid of that. Something else that you should cut back in the fall, and I've already done mine, are Veronica. Again, I leave basil foliage, which is just the small green leaves at the base of the plant. That actually protects the plant over the winter from crown rot and from heave. So it's a good idea to leave that basil foliage. Perennial geraniums don't necessarily need any winter maintenance. I have several different kinds around the property. This is an espresso geranium. At this time of the year, it's no longer getting any sun, so it tends to go crispy and kind of almost disappear. Those I will definitely cut those back to the ground. Again, leaving a little bit of a stalk so I know where the plant is next spring. I'll show you the Boom Chocolata that I have as well that will also get cut back. That one goes a pretty deep red. I don't know if that one will keep its leaves all winter. I suspect not. If you live in a warmer climate, you probably get away with leaving it. Mine are kind of looking raggedy because they've been eaten. You can see how pretty the foliage goes. but really all I am left with is stalks. So that'll be another one that I'll cut back definitely in the fall. Another plant that you want to cut back in the fall, especially in colder climates, because it starts to decline and it just no longer looks pretty, is catmint. Now we've already cut ours back. And you can see we just leave the stalks. It doesn't particularly look pretty in colder climates over the winter. If it stays warm, it can be semi-evergreen. But we like to definitely clean catmint up in the fall. Great blue lobelia is an example of a plant that maybe many people do not have in their gardens, but if you do, it's definitely something you want to clean up. It tends to get mushy, almost like hostas, and just kind of goes limp. And when it lays on the ground, anywhere it lays is a chance for it to set roots and spread. It's a native plant, but it can be very aggressive at spreading. You can see all that green down there is newly spreading great blue lobelia. But because I don't like the way they look in the winter, those are definitely something you'd want to cut back. We also have cardinal flowers. One more thing about the lobelia is you do want to leave the basal foliage, which again you can see that green foliage. Get my shadow out of the way. You want to cut the stalks down to the base of that. The same with the cardinal flower, the red one. We have a couple of those growing over here. They tend to be a little bit sturdier than the great blue lobelia, but we'll still come through and cut the stalks off. They look pretty again for a few weeks, and then they kind of get mushy like the blue lobelia. But again, we will leave that basal foliage. Another plant that you can leave standing for the winter is Baptisia. Now they will go brown and crispy. Ours are not quite there yet, but if yours have any interesting seed heads, they will rattle in the winter breeze. So some people like to hear that sound. These are not close enough to the house for us to hear that. But, you know, it's a kind of a personal preference on the Baptisia. You can either leave it or cut it back in the spring. I don't see any seed heads on ours, and since they're going to get moved in the spring for us anyway, we're just going to go ahead and cut them back. Another group of plants that is, again, personal preference are the grasses. We have several spots in our yard where we have really tall, structurally beautiful miscanthus grasses. Right now they have their seed heads on, which are really, really pretty at this time of the year when a lot of stuff is kind of looking way past its peak. It's nice to be able to look outside and see the miscanthus. Miscanthus grasses we'll leave as long as we can and then cut them back. Once it gets really, really windy in the winter and these go brown and crispy, I'm going to say probably sometime around Christmas. Again, it just depends on the year and how the weather goes. These can start to blow all over and become a mess in the garden. So again, because we prefer to have a tidy yard in winter, we tend to cut ours back once they get to that spot. And we also don't want them to become invasive. Now, miscanthus is not a native. It is considered invasive in a lot of spots because these seed heads, once they start to open up, the wind will carry them everywhere. I don't want this becoming a problem in my yard or any of my neighbors' yards. So again, miscanthus is a grass that we leave standing for as long as we can, but then we'll cut it back within about 6 inches of the ground. Some grasses you can definitely leave standing because they're not invasive. We have a native panicum grass right here, which is looking really pretty. We'll leave this one. It's already starting to go brown. It's still standing rather upright. You know, if halfway through the winter we decide that it's just all flopped and laying on the ground, then we can absolutely come in and cut it back. But for us, miscanthus, or panicum, is definitely a grass we can leave standing. There's one exception to that. We have 3 panicum cloud 9s at the front of our bottom rain garden that get really, really big, and they get really floppy really early in the season, kind of like late August, early September. Those we have already cut back. because we don't want them laying all over the plants in our rain garden. There's nothing here that these panicums are going to lay on. So, and because they're still standing, these panicums we definitely leave. Another grass that you can leave if it's not invasive in your area are pennisetums. We have 4 lemon squeeze pennisetums here. And these have some tall, strong, upright structure that will be pretty once they go really, really brown. These seed heads will remain. So that will look nice in the winter. And again, if it looks like they're going to halfway through the season start to look floppy or just not be attractive anymore, you can absolutely come through and cut these back. I have a dwarf Hamelin grass, which is also a pennisetum that I'll show you, which is looking really pretty right now. And this is one we definitely leave. It's in our side yard, so the only time we really see it is if we come out here, which we generally don't much in the winter. But this one is looking really pretty. It's full, and you can kind of see why it's called fountain grass. So again, this one we'll leave and clean up in the spring. But grasses, again, really a personal preference. You can go for it and cut all your grasses back in the fall, or you can leave them till spring. So I want to show you one more example of a plant that you should leave standing in the fall, and that's agastache. Now, I feel like agastache has become more popular over the years. They're coming out with more and more varieties all the time. Pretty pinks and purples, as well as the blues. But they are definitely a plant you should leave standing to protect the crown. And I have a rather big one right here. The seed heads are really, really pretty, which is a reason why we want to leave them, to look at them, but also just to protect the plant. You also want to make sure that if you're planting agastache, you're planting them in really well-drained soil. They do not like winter wet. But as you can see, ours has started to develop some more foliage at the base. It even has a newer flower that's probably just developed in the last couple of weeks. Having a hard time seeing that because of the sun. There we go. So if I wanted to come out and cut these, I could, and then just leave this foliage at the bottom. But because this is our upper rain garden, it's a little bit far from the house, so we don't see this quite as much. We'll leave the seed heads. We get 90% of our stuff cut back in the fall. It's not too big of a problem to come up here in the spring and just cut a few things. We do still have some pretty cornflowers. Week before Thanksgiving, blooming. I didn't originally have irises on my list of plants to talk about today, but I feel like people do have irises. It's pretty popular. And you can see why they should be cut back. They're starting to really decline now just in the last few weeks, and they're just kind of laying all over the ground, and I don't want that because, again, I don't want to harbor bad pests and insects under that foliage. So irises are definitely another plant that you can cut back in the fall. Another plant that we will go through and clean up at this time of the year because it doesn't necessarily look really pretty and it gets more and more difficult to clean up as time goes on are daylilies. This is what they look like at this time of the year. It's not easy to clean up once they get to this point. We probably should have cleaned these up a few weeks back. But daylilies are definitely a plant that you want to clean up in the fall because, like I said, they just kind of lay on the ground. They can harbor pests and bad insects in there. So you want to get those cleaned up. Here's another one, not looking particularly pretty. These ones over here have gone completely brown. Another plant, again, completely up to you, is sedum. In some gardens throughout the winter, they look really, really pretty. They have a strong structure. They stand upright. Because ours don't get full sun, they don't have the prettiest look. as the fall and winter wear on, so we'll definitely cut those back. But again, that's a personal preference. I think we discussed salvias, but not in depth. So I'm going to show you the caradonna salvias we have growing up here. Again, months ago I already did a hard cut back on those when they were done flowering. These will get cut back again. And again, if there's any basal foliage, that will get left to protect the crown of the plant in fall. I do see some basal foliage way down in that one. So that's what I mean by basal foliage. Anything that's at the base of the plant, a lot of the times you want to leave that just to protect the plant through the winter. And I think the last plant we're going to discuss is yarrow. Yarrow is definitely a plant that you want to cut back in the fall. And again, you want to leave the basal foliage, if any, to protect the plant. Yarrows don't particularly look pretty once they start to go brown. So here is an example of a yarrow here. I don't really see any basal foliage in there, so I'll cut this one back within a couple of inches of the ground. If anything is left, it'll go brown, but at least I'll be able to see where the plant is in the spring. So that's it, guys. Just a quick how-to video, so to speak, on what you should cut back in the fall and what you can leave until the spring. Again, a lot of it is personal preference. If you just have too many other tasks in the spring, so go ahead and cut things back in the fall. If you have too many tasks in the fall, by all means, go ahead and wait till the spring to cut back your perennials, with a few exceptions. So I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks, and we'll see you in the next one.